I, 29F, have been married to my husband, 32M, for 3 years now. I'm not particularly close to my family, but my husband has always been very close to his. His family consists of only his mother and his older sister, since his father had never been in the picture and neither has he ever met the man. My sister-in-law, 35F, lost her husband to a heart attack a few months back, and we were all really sorry for her since they'd only been married for a year. I had a good relationship with both of them earlier, we were civil to each other. But after her husband's death, things changed. Initially, my sister-in-law would occasionally ask me to run some errands for her because she claimed she was feeling too depressed to do anything, and I'd agree gladly because I wanted to help her out while she was in mourning. And besides, they were only small errands at the time, like buying her groceries or doing her laundry for her. Easy household chores which I was ready to do without much of a fuss. Sometimes I'd be too busy with my own work and I'd feel compelled to decline, but then my mother-in-law would call me immediately afterward and emotionally manipulate me into doing what was asked of me by reminding me that my sister-in-law was a grieving widow and I needed to show her some kindness and compassion. So I'd do that and end up doing the chores that she asked me to do, even if I myself was dog-tired from my own day. I never mentioned any of this to my husband either, because he was mostly at work for the day, and when he came back, he'd be really tired. Also, this was about his family and he's very close to them, so I didn't know how to bring it up with him either, and the longer it went on, the more awkward it began to feel. So I just didn't say anything and continued to do whatever my sister-in-law asked me to, and after a while, I was practically her maid because she was making me do everything. Right from cooking her meals, to doing her laundry, and buying her groceries. She probably would have even made me mop the floors of her house, but thankfully she liked doing that herself since it was good exercise. Anyway, this went on for about 3 months, and by the third month, I would be exhausted from working myself to the bone every day. I was taking care of my house, my sister-in-law's apartment, and my business, and it was just incredibly exhausting. I wanted to talk to my husband about it, but I was still feeling really awkward about it and couldn't find the right time to sit him down and have a discussion about this. I was also skeptical of how he would react to this, so I kept it to myself and decided to deal with this situation myself. However, about a week ago, my sister-in-law had me run an errand for her which required me to go through her files, and I ended up calling the cops on her and my mother-in-law because of what I discovered. She'd just resumed work after almost 3 months of working from home, and she'd turned her guest room into an office for herself so that it'd be more convenient for her. Fortunately or unfortunately, the day that she was supposed to resume work, she'd accidentally left her laptop at home because she was out of practice. So she asked me to get it for her, and after a bit of bickering, I obliged since her house would be on my way to work anyway. I've had the keys to her house for a while, and when I went into her office, I realized that she'd left her laptop open and unattended on the desk. It wasn't password protected, and my fingers accidentally brushed the touchpad which activated it. It opened to a screen of an email which she'd abandoned midway, and surprisingly, it was an email to her mother. She was telling her about some documents that had been created and she'd send them to Dad's lawyers at the earliest. I was very confused because for her dad's lawyers to be in touch with her would mean that my father-in-law had somehow been in touch with her, and that was strange because they hadn't heard from him for the past 35 years. So I could sense immediately that something was off about this and decided to throw her other emails and her files. After digging through her emails, I realized that her father's lawyers had indeed been in touch with her, and that was because the man had passed away recently. About a month ago, she'd received some email from her dad's lawyer regarding his will where he'd left all his money and property to his ex-partner, my mother-in-law, his kids, and their families if they had any. The lawyer didn't have her mobile number, so he had to use the email address that he'd found after some research. He'd added in the mail that he'd been trying to reach my husband as well, but had been unable to so far, and had requested my sister-in-law to provide him with his details so that he could reach him. It was quite natural since my husband is pretty much untraceable since he has no social media presence, and the lawyer had been unable to locate him. My sister-in-law was listed on her company's website, so he was still able to find her and had been counting on her to let him know my husband's contact info as well. As it turns out, my deceased father-in-law had been quite a wealthy man, and it was almost a $500,000 inheritance that was to be divided between us all, not including the other assets that he'd left us. My sister-in-law had been emailing her mother back and forth about all of this since my mother-in-law didn't have any social media and she didn't like texting, so emails were her go-to. Through bits and pieces, I found out that they'd been planning to hog the entire inheritance for themselves and were trying to brainstorm a way where they wouldn't have to share any of it with my husband and me. So my sister-in-law had come up with the bright idea of claiming that my husband was no longer alive and had even forged a death certificate for him which she'd emailed my mother-in-law. I could hardly believe my eyes when I realized what they'd been up to all along. They'd very cleverly come up with a clever plan to exclude my husband from his well-deserved inheritance because they wanted to hog it all for themselves, and as soon as I got over the shock of it, I immediately called the cops. I recorded all the evidence I could find on my phone and then sent it to my husband while waiting for the police to arrive. In the meantime, my sister-in-law kept messaging me because I was running at least an hour late, and she ended up coming back home. She and the cops arrived at almost the same time, and as soon as entered the house, She tried to make a run for it, but fortunately, one of the officers grabbed her and placed her under arrest to prevent that from happening again. I guess she'd figured out what was happening and kept insisting that she'd split the inheritance if I didn't press charges, but I was in no mood to listen to any of her nonsense. I decided to press charges against both my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law even before my husband could respond because I was just done. They'd made me work like a maid for months and had tried to cheat my husband out of his inheritance at the same time. This is the lowest that any human being could go, and they, unfortunately, decided to go that way. So they were placed under house arrest, and their calls and texts were under supervision by the police while they investigated the laptop that I handed over to them as evidence. They also seized my mother-in-law's laptop and had 2 officers patrolling the area around both their houses. Their movements are being closely monitored, and in short, they have no shot at escaping. Now, I pressed charges about a week ago and the investigation is still underway, which is normal because our police department is kind of slow when it comes to technology, from what I've been told. I haven't spoken to or seen my in-laws ever since I pressed charges. I'd already told my husband what I'd found out just after I'd called the cops, and after I was done with all the legalities and paperwork, I went straight back home where my husband was waiting for me to talk to him. He seemed upset when I told him that I'd already called the cops and told them everything that I'd found. He said that it was technically his father and his inheritance and told me that I should have kept out of this and let him deal with it instead of getting the cops involved. I was quite surprised at his reaction since I felt like I'd done the right thing. Also, it technically wasn't his inheritance alone, since his lawyer had clearly stated in the scanned document of the will that he'd sent that his inheritance was to be divided between my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my husband, and their families. My sister-in-law didn't have a family, and my husband's family apart from his mother and sister was me. So technically, it was my inheritance as well, and that's why the police let me press charges in the first place, I think. I even said this to him, but he insisted that I'd been out of line and I shouldn't have meddled in his personal business because now he'd have to be caught up in some legal battle against his own family. I didn't understand or like the way he was reacting to this, and I ended up losing my temper with him. I finally brought up the way his mother and sister had been treating me so far and had been forcing me to work for them day and night, but I hadn't said anything because I did think of them to my family to a certain extent, and also because I felt bad for my sister-in-law because she'd been widowed at such a young age. So I'd done everything that they'd asked me to without any complaints, but I hadn't received as much as a thank you in return for it because that's how entitled and rude they were. On top of that, they'd been trying to cheat us out of an insane inheritance just because they were greedy, and once again, yes, because they were nothing but 2 entitled women with cunning minds and an ungrateful and selfish heart. My husband was taken aback by my outburst and withdrew into himself after that without even trying to defend what he'd said or his family. I thought we'd talk things out after a day or 2, but that didn't happen, and even though a week has passed, he hasn't resumed speaking to me normally. He's still being very quiet and distant, and I really don't know how to fix this or even if I should be the one who needs to fix this right now. We've had our fair share of fights before this, but never one like this. Ida for pressing charges against my mother-in-law and sister-in-law for trying to cheat my husband and me out of our inheritance without consulting him first. Update 1. I went through all the comments on my original post last night, and I want to thank everyone who decided to comment. Thank you for the kind words. 3 days have passed since I posted, and my husband and I still haven't spoken about things. No word from the detectives assigned to our case either, which means they're still working on authentication of the emails. But at least now, thanks to you guys and my parents, I know that I did nothing wrong. His sister and mother were making me run around, do her chores and whatnot just because she lost her husband and couldn't bring herself to get out of bed on most days, but when it came to cheating and defrauding people, she was on her A game. I don't understand why my husband is still trying to defend her, and who was going to face the biggest financial loss of his entire life had I not intervened at the right time. And I'm 100% sure that even if I had called him before the police and asked for his advice, he would have talked to his mother and his sister, and they would have very easily manipulated him to let them have the inheritance because they're both single women, on their own, and needed the inheritance much more than we do. I can just hear my husband telling me to let it go because life has been harder on them than on us, which is just an absurd way of looking at things, but that's how he always sees it. Even in our last argument, he kept insisting that I shouldn't have gone straight to the cops and should have at least given them a chance to explain themselves because of the same old life has been hard for them bullcrap. I'm sorry, but life has been hard on all of us. I lost my twin brother in a car accident 2 days before we were supposed to appear for our SOTs, but I still took the test and even scored well. I haven't yet gotten over the grief of that, and I don't think I ever will. Neither am I implying that everyone should be the same way that I am, but people should at least have the humanity to not use their spouses or loved ones' demise as an excuse for their messed up behavior. It cheapens their relationship with their loved ones and also lets the world know what a disgusting and shallow human being you are, which is exactly what happened with my sister-in-law and her mom. They were even willing to pass off my husband as a deceased man just for the sake of money, and if that's not enough to make him see how crazy and greedy they are, then I don't know what is. Update 2. Okay, so I posted an update this morning and I just spoke to my husband 3 hours back. I sat him down after work, and even though he said he was tired, I told him that this discussion needed to be had right now and we couldn't just keep putting it off indefinitely because that's not how healthy marriages work. And I don't know about him, but I wanted our marriage to remain as healthy as possible despite whatever happened and whatever had been said and done so far. So he gave in and decided to talk to me. I was blunt and told him point blank that I couldn't have him continuing to support his mother and sister despite what they did because it was disgusting and low, and the fact that he hadn't spoken to me for over a week because he was mad at me for reporting them to the police was crazy. I reminded him yet again that I had every right to do what I'd done since it was very clearly mentioned that the inheritance belonged to me as well as him because I was his family. I was the reason he still stood a chance to get a part of the inheritance that his father had left for him, and had it not been for me, his sister probably would have taken it all for herself and his mom without even thinking twice about him. So it just didn't seem worth it for him to be fighting with me, his only well-wisher as it seems, for their sake. They're the ones who'd tried to pass him off deceased and they didn't even feel sorry for it. They're the ones who were more than happy to screw him over for their own gain, and yet here he was, fighting with me because of them. Also, let's not forget how we even got to this point and how I found out about all of this. They'd been making me work like a maid while cheating me out of a fortune. So to me, they were the epitome of evil and selfishness, and I told my husband straight up that I would leave him if he defended his mother and sister or fought with me for them ever again after this point. He needed to choose between me and them, and that choice had to be final. I probably sounded crazy to him, but I didn't care. I'd let people push me around for a long time and I couldn't let them do that to me anymore. My husband stayed silent for a few minutes and I was afraid he'd say that I could leave, but instead, he chose to apologize and told me he wasn't mad that I'd reported his sister or his mother. I was surprised at that statement because so far, that's what it seemed like. But he continued and told me that he was scared because I'd contacted the police, and let's just say he didn't have a good history with cops. My husband and a friend of his had been arrested for a bit of underage drinking in college, which isn't that big of a deal, but they'd been treated really cruelly and that had pretty much scarred him for life. I won't get into the details, but trust me, it was disturbing to hear. I don't know why the cops had been so extreme with them, but he'd ended up fracturing his wrist because of that altercation, but the officers got off scot-free. It finally made sense why my husband was so wary of cops anyway. But most importantly, this whole thing wasn't even about his mother and sister in the first place, but more about the fact that he was worried that they'd be treated in the same brutal way that he'd been. When I reassured him that that was not the case since they'd only been placed under house arrest for now, and even if they were found guilty of fraud, they probably still wouldn't face that long of a sentence. I didn't like them much and I definitely did want them to be punished, but not the way my husband had been as a teenager. After that, he told me that he had in fact visited his family to make sure they were all right, and once he was sure that they weren't being mistreated, he totally chewed them out for everything that they'd done so far, and even told them that he was cutting all ties with them once and for all, so they shouldn't expect any mercy during the trial. He'd been planning to talk to me and break the ice for a while now, but just didn't know how to do it because he felt like he'd failed me as a husband. He said he'd been feeling way too awkward and useless to even speak to me because all this while, I'd been going through so much and he'd just been doing nothing about it. He was oblivious to everything and felt like a complete fool for letting such things happen. I had to tell him that part of it was my fault because I'd chosen not to share how his mother and sister had been treating me simply because I didn't want to stress him out any more than he already was, but clearly, that really didn't work out well for us and we just kept growing apart. We decided that we just hit a rough patch and weren't communicating enough, so we needed to work on that. As for the inheritance, he's obviously happy that his father left him so much and seemed to have a change of heart before passing away, and said that he'd like to find out more about him. That also made me realize that I'd been dumb and I'd totally forgotten to contact the lawyer who had been dealing with the will. I'm going to speak to the cops as soon as I can and try to get the email address that the lawyer had been using so that we can at least get our share of whatever was left to us. Call us greedy, but we've been working hard enough and we deserve this. We've earned this. Update 3. So my mother-in-law and sister-in-law are going to jail for 2 years. It's a lenient sentence for them and they might be able to get out of good behavior, but for now, that's what their sentence is. It's been a while since my last update here, but at least I have good news to share. My husband and I have already received the amount that was left to us, and we've also inherited one of the houses that my father-in-law had. He'd also left us all a letter stating that he'd indeed had a change of heart a few years back, but it was too late to make things right and he wanted to go peacefully and without any hassle, so he'd left us all his wealth since he had no family of his own to leave it to. He'd been suffering from pancreatic cancer for a while and had finally succumbed to it this year. My husband had been really upset that he didn't get to meet his father even once in his entire life, but at least the man had come around and left us something before he passed on, and that was a beautiful gesture. So wherever he is, I hope he's happy now. We've decided to sell our previous house and move into the one that we inherited, since this is in a much better neighborhood and is just an overall nicer house to live in. It's much bigger and prettier and it kind of fits my childhood dream of what my future home would look like. My husband has also decided to quit his dead-end job and join me as a business partner. We wanted to do that earlier, but since my business is still small, he was hesitant to quit his job because at least it paid well. But now that we had the money, we could afford to scale up my business and he could finally quit his job and join me full-time. We're looking forward to this move because it's a huge deal for us and we feel like we're one step closer to all our dreams being fulfilled, one by one. Also, we have decided to take the advice that most people here seem to agree on and are going to start looking at marriage counselors. The way we dealt with the last crisis was unhealthy, to say the least, and even though that's solved now, I wouldn't want a repeat of this, and the only way to move forward is to get a professional involved here. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so very kind to us. Wish us luck for our new journey as business partners now.